Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI Podcast Series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Lee.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone.
We are here. I am Tonya.
And I'm Erika. And it's really good to see all of you again.
Yes.
Thank you for joining another episode of our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance.
Mm-hmm. So today's topic is, will the real allies please stand up?
Please. So we really like this topic. We like all our topics, but this episode we're really excited about. As you know, in our podcast series, we really try to discuss issues that prevent us from being socially just and free. And so we feel like this topic really sort of leads us to our goal of disrupting the status quo and just being the change that we want to see. And so we're going to talk about allyship today.
Yeah, so we're really excited about this topic because this is something that everybody can benefit from. So when we think about allyship, before we get into what we mean when we talk about allyship, because we have our own like allyship continuum, because that's what we do. We come up with things. But before we talk about that, I think we have to kind of touch on privilege again. We have talked about privilege. A lot of times when people think about privilege, they are almost always talking about or thinking about like racial privilege. Yeah. And while that is significant and still very important, we also want to point out that we have privilege that may not have anything to do with our race or ethnicity.
Sure.
So you want to kind of run down some of those?
Yeah. So in a previous podcast episode, I talked about height, right? Yeah. So I am 5'4". So that's, I don't have the height that you have, so I'm considered actually short. So when I go to a grocery store, there are times when I can't reach things. So I have to, hope that somebody, yes, I will give my husband a break. But things that are on higher shelves or whatever, like I can't, so I can't reach. So very often those kinds of things aren't necessarily built for me. So I also think about when I go shopping for slacks or, even sort of a long skirt, right? So if there's not a petite section, I know I'm going to have to buy the slacks or the pants or the jeans and then have them tailored because there's just no way, they'll be too long. And so when we think about privilege, it's almost, I like to think about like those things that you don't have to think about. Right. So if you're taller than 5'5" or whatever, you really don't have to think about whether or not you can reach something or hope that somebody's going to be in the grocery store for you. You don't really have to think about like you have open access to that particular resource.
Absolutely.
And that really is, when I think about privilege, we see privilege in, so that's just an example in terms of the height, but we see privilege around race. We see privilege around ability. We see privilege around language. So we see all of those things where, sometimes people have to think about the access that they will have because they don't enjoy privilege in a certain area.
Right. And I think that's really important to consider because, you could probably see yourself in, any one of those areas that we talked about when it comes to privilege.
Yeah.
And what's really important is because you don't have to think about those issues, if you will, we want to challenge you to begin to think about them. We want you to think about where you have an advantage, where someone else doesn't have an advantage. And that's really what we mean by allyship. I mean, that's just a piece of it because we kind of really talk through this a little bit more, and we kind of break down allyship just along the lines of a continuum. Looking at what the research says about allyship and really just kind of coming up with our own spin on it that I think you'll find yourself somewhere on this continuum, because really allyship is more like a journey.
Yeah, it is. It is, rather than sort of like this fixed point, and this fixed point for all things, right? So what we have found, and what you will probably find in the course of this conversation, is that maybe you're further along in some areas and not so much in other areas. And some of that has to do with the privilege that you have in that particular area or category. So let's break down like the continuum. So where do we start?
So we start with the non-ally. So the non-ally is just that.
Yeah.
That's the person who essentially is oblivious to the advantages that they might have. They're oblivious to injustices that might occur as a result of people being marginalized because they don't have certain privilege. And so that non-ally is, people don't want to see themselves as a non-ally because they may see that as like a negative.
Right.
But really they're still sleeping on what's going on around them.
And sometimes it's passive in terms of just being oblivious, but sometimes it's actively disagreeing that an injustice is happening in a particular area, right? So they're not an ally because they flat out don't want to be. They deny. We talked about DEI deniers in an earlier podcast, but they really deny the fact that injustice exists for a particular group of people.
Right. Yeah. And so, those non-ally folks don't have to stay as non-allies. Essentially, they can move up or move along the continuum, and they can become, bystanders.
Yeah.
And we hear stories about bystanders all the time. We also hear where, and I think you would know what a bystander is, but just so that we are on the same page, a bystander is really somebody that notices that something may be going on, but they don't want to get involved.
Yeah. And so after the bystander, we have the upholder, right? So we've gone from the non-ally who's like, either oblivious or denying that there is injustice. We go to the bystander who notices the injustice but does nothing. And then we go to the upholder. And this person observes the injustice but really doesn't know like what to do. And so that not knowing upholds the status quo.
Right.
So so they just like don't know. So I know that this is happening. I know that this group is being marginalized. I know that there is a challenge here. There's injustice here. I just don't know what to do.
Women have had to endure a lot when it comes to sexual harassment in particular. I think about, times that I've been catcalled or, which basically is, someone has like made a comment. A random person has made a comment about you or your body parts, without your permission. You see that we've been in places or spaces where someone may make comments about women in demeaning ways. And, if you're an upholder in those situations, meaning you just kind of allow it to continue to happen, then it's going to continue to happen. And at the expense of, women who potentially could be voiceless and powerless in positions where there may be others who hold power, who are the ones that are actually causing the harm, if you will.
And I think just sort of like, so, you're in a position where somebody is objectifying or, a woman, put, any woman in your life in that seat. So, your daughter or your mom, what would you do if this was happening to that, that person, that loved one in your life? And I think once we do that, once we become more empathetic, then we're in a space where we want to take action, right? Because now we feel it.
So let's go along the continuum some more. So we've got after the upholder, we've got the conveyor.
We got the conveyor.
Yeah.
We got the conveyor. So this person notices the injustice. They feel really badly about it, and their actions are more passive. So we see something on social media and we like it, and maybe we pass it along. That's the conveyor. They sort of convey the message. So a little bit more active than sort of the other three that we just discussed.
Sure.
A little bit more active than the upholder, more active than the bystander. But that's sort of the limit there are very serious limits to what they will actually do, or what they can actually do.
Yeah.
But that's the conveyor.
Yeah, and I would say the conveyor oftentimes may be passive because they might risk, we've talked about this in previous podcasts, they might risk losing capital.
Yes.
They belong to a group that really is not aligned to the injustices.
Yeah.
That's not even the right way to say it, but
go ahead. No, but they do, they belong to a group that may not either, the group themselves may be non-allies or bystanders, right? So they may be people who are, perpetrating some of those injustices, either by their speech or their actions or their lack of action. So, or just by their apathy. They're just, they just don't care.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true. And unfortunately, when that happens, if I'm a conveyor and, so you talked with the upstander part of the continuum, you talked about empathy. As a conveyor, I probably have a little more empathy.
Yeah.
Because I see an injustice and it's like, oh, that really isn't right, and, I don't want people to think that I agree with this injustice. And so, I'm going to be bold and I'm going to hit the like, or I'm going to share it on my social media post.
Right.
But you're not going to see too much more from me, and you're not going to hear too much more from me. I'm not going to necessarily speak out against something.
Right.
You're not going to see me marching. You're not going to see any overt actions.
Right.
But at least, people will know that, that I care about these issues.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we go from conveyor to the supporter.
Yeah. And so the supporter really kind of is willing to take a little bit more action. Yeah. They're not just kind of sitting back, allowing the injustices to occur. They are the ones that are going to speak up, but they might speak up if it's happening to somebody that they know. Right. So that is not nice what you said to my friend Erika. Like, she is a woman. You should respect her as a woman. That. The supporter cares about the people that they know, and they are not afraid to speak on behalf of their friends or their loved ones about some kind of injustice that may occur. We've also seen where the supporters could also be an organization that writes a letter, or that puts a statement on their website that says, we are an anti-Black not anti-Black.
Anti-racist.
Anti-racist. Oh, God.
Like, who is it? Who's anti-Black?
Exactly. I'm like, that's terrible. We are an anti-racist organization, or we are an anti, any kind of injustice against any group of, marginalized, any marginalized group of people. The supporter is gonna, but again, that's still a little passive, but it at least, there's a little less fear around letting the world know how I feel about this, because it might hit home.
Right.
And then we have the champion.
So now we're getting to the more active end of the continuum. And so the champion openly stands in solidarity with oppressed or marginalized people. They identify as champions for justice, but their actions are limited, right? So they may go on a march.
Yes.
They may go on a march, right? They may buy from an organization or support an organization. You talked about the organization that says, we're an anti-racist, organization. So we may support that, or because I'm a champion for that, that cause. But but I don't know if I'm going to move the needle here, but everybody knows how I feel about this particular issue.
You're vocal about it.
Yeah.
Then we've got the influencer.
The influencer.
Yeah, let's talk about the influencer.
Yes.
Because the influencer has a little power.
That's right. They're able to use their own privilege.
Yes.
And their social capital. You talked about social capital earlier.
Right,
So they use their privilege and their social capital to make recommendations for change in the system.
Right.
In the system.
Right. So I've got my own personal example of that. So, we've talked about being, at the state. And so while I was there, I would say that I was an influencer. I wanted to be the next level, but unfortunately, some of the power I did not hold.
Yeah.
But I had position of power.
That access.
And so, the area that I was fighting for was educational equity. And obviously, this is the work that we do all the time. So this is still very important to me. But it was really critical that when there was new new regulations that regulations that needed to be revised or practices, that I was going to be vocal in trying to influence the language, some of the programming or some of the activities or how funds were being allocated. And so I used my privilege as a leader in that organization to speak up and to make recommendations for change. And so, that is how the influencer operates.
I think ultimately the goal is to be an ally.
Right.
Be an ally, right? Use your privilege to support the freedom, really, and and limiting marginalization for people, like for all groups. I mean, that really is our work. And taking us back to our question, why is this so hard? And I think that's one of the things. I think really understanding allyship is one of the reasons why sometimes we don't really understand it.
Yeah. And so where are you on this continuum?
Yeah.
And that's a parting question that we have for you. Where are you in the continuum? We want to hear from you. So please reach out to us on any of our social media platforms. Let us know what you think. Repost this and share your thoughts. Again, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Take care, everyone.